Carlan Gay here for Sporting News, and pleased to be joined by Michael Buffer, Boxing Hall of Famer. It's weird for me to do an introduction for you because you've made the introduction famous.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready to rumble!
Things have changed a little bit in the fight game in terms of how it's kind of broadcasted. Obviously, you've seen that progression. You know, premium cable, I guess regular cable, network
streaming
TV, and now streaming is the thing.
Everybody wants to do streaming.
And do you see that changing the way fights are being made between fighters and promoters? And from your perspective,
you know, I wish I actually had an answer and an opinion on that, but it's kind of like new. I have my own thing that I do, of course, but that, you know, that's really with the broadcasters and the promoters and all that. And, you know, maybe in a year or two from now, I can step back and because it's all new, you know, and so that's all falling into place. And I think it's a great deal. I think it gives more exposure to fighters now because more fights are going to be seen. When DAZN has a show, you see every fight.
Right.
If it's 8, if it's 7, you'll see them all. And when I first started to do this in the middle 80s, 1983, the #1 show on ESPN, this little fledgling cable network, was Top Rank Boxing on ESPN. And that really was the catalyst to give me a lot of exposure because they would do, it was the #1 show, but back then they didn't have all the programming.
Right.
And they would rebroadcast the fights 6 and 7 times a week, you know, 3 in the morning, and the exposure was unbelievable. And it gave all these fighters exposure too, because we would do 5 fights on the air at that time. And you got to see the young fighters coming up, Donald Curry and Boom Boom Mancini and that sort of thing. And then, you know, they became exposed and world championship fighters. So it was a great thing for the fighters.
Back then, it wasn't "Let's get ready to rumble," though. It was something else.
Back then, it was 10 rounds of boxing in the welterweight division.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I sort of had an idea where I wanted a hook for the main event primarily. What was happening was other ring announcers had created this thing where their buddies on the boxing commissions, they would introduce them all.
Right.
And it would be, you know, 4 doctors and 4 commissioners and a chairman and executive director. And if the WBC or WEA was involved, their supervisor and their president, and you killed the crowd. A fighter comes to the ring, and they're playing music, and it's exciting, and then you just flatten the room out, take all the electricity out of the room. So I wanted that gentlemen start your engines moment, you know, where you hear that, and even though it was some little old lady, it would say, "Gentlemen, start your engines." Everybody got excited because they knew the fight was going to start. And so I wanted a hook to bring everybody's back to the fact that you're going to meet the stars of the show. And so I, you know, started out with "Man your battle stations." You know, I had no idea what I was doing, and tried "Fasten your seatbelts" and that sort of thing. And then, of course, you know, the great Muhammad Ali was famous for his weigh-in and pre-fight banters with. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee.
Much like a wrestler.
Rumble, young man, rumble, you know, and he would say, "I'm ready to rumble," and I kind of started saying, "Let's get ready to rumble," and stayed with it. It's a lot different then than it is now, and it kind of worked out pretty well.
I tell you, sitting across from you right now, I feel the energy and how excited you talk about the fight game. And you mentioned maybe, you know, a year or 2 from now, you might be stepping back, and then they pulled you back in. You know, what keeps you going? What keeps you excited about standing in that ring with, you know, thousands of people waiting for your
You know what it
words?
really is? I'm a fan. And, you know, I'll find myself in the center of the ring, big fight. You know, here comes Klitschko and Joshua and Wembley, 90,000 people. And I'm watching these ring walks, and I'm like, man, this is great. I just can't wait to introduce them and sit down and watch the fight. I'm a fan. You know, I go back to being hooked on Sugar Ray Robinson and the last years of his career, and just about in tears when he lost those 2 fights to Paul Pender, and just, you knew he just wasn't the same Sugar Ray Robinson anymore.
Right.
And, you know, even sold Jersey Joe Walcott when I was really young. You know, my dad let me stay up, and you know, Marciano and Floyd Patterson, black and white TV in the 50s, great stuff.
You get a ringside seat all the time. Is there a fight that sticks out amongst all of them that you've been able to see that is like, that's the one that
You're talking about
remember?
almost 40 years worth of fights.
That's a lot, yeah.
But there are moments that stick out.
Okay.
So, a lot of great fights. I mean, you know, De La Hoya, Trinidad, and some of the fights, it's more or less like great moments. And one of my favorites is George Foreman, 44 years old.
Wow.
Defeated Michael Moorer in 1994, lost every round. I mean, looked terrible, and he was going to lose. And it's the 10th round, and all of a sudden, 1-2, 1-2, and he lands that last right hand, and you knew Moorer wasn't going to get up. And the moment, the crowd, usually there's an explosion of noise in a big fight when a fighter goes down. This was like a collective, and then the roar, and it was fantastic, a moment like that.
Really was. I think people forget how feared George Foreman was, you know, prior to the Ali fights. He was probably one of the baddest men walking around the planet, and then became, I guess, the George Foreman with maybe the dad bod, I guess, later on in his years. He might
have been a better fighter in the second coming of George Foreman. I think he thinks he was, and I've heard him say that he was. And he was maybe not as good, but maybe a better, really tough fighter. And it's an interesting way of looking at it. But yeah, it was great to be associated with those Foreman fights, along with Holyfield and Bo and Mike Tyson and all the rest, a lot of fights there. You know, the thing about this stage of my career as a fan, you know, when you're young, when you're a kid, like, I wasn't a kid when Muhammad Ali was a fighter, but I was still that young guy.
Right.
You hated every other fighter. You know, you have that fanboy thing. Just like I'm from Philadelphia. I hated everybody in the National League except the Phillies. You know, and just, you know, until Pete Rose came to the Phillies years ago, I hated him because he was the enemy, you see? And so when you get older, you like to appreciate it. And just like that Foreman-Moorer fight, I was heartbroken for Moorer and just elated for George at the same time. It's that thrill of victory and agony of defeat. And I mean, I had tears in my eyes. You know, I knew Michael Moorer since he was like 19, and he was the undefeated light heavyweight champ, knocking guys like, you know, with like at that time I think like 29 wins, 29 knockouts. I mean, a spectacular fighter, and a lot of thought about he's really going to be a great heavyweight, and which he was. He won the title, beat Holyfield. And it was heartbreaking. You know, his mom is sitting there, and so it's the same way. Here's Jacobs and Canelo, you know, two guys that I respect, and Triple G, who I love. You know, these guys have to fight each other. So, you know, I cheer for one guy, and my heart aches for the other, you know, in a lot of these fights.
You've obviously called a ton of championship fights, but you know, 10 years ago, things kind of took a turn for you. You were diagnosed with cancer, and you kind of were thinking about what were you going through in that moment, and trying to fight the disease?
I was 63 at the time, and I figured, well, you know, it's been a good run, you know, 30-some years, and almost 30 years doing it, and at that time, and I figured. I was optimistic. I thought I was going to, you know, things were going to be okay. I had a great surgeon, and I wasn't sure if I'd, you know, be able to work again. So I woke up in the OR, you know, afterwards in recovery, and curtains were all around me. I was by myself, and I clear-headed and realized where I was and what was going on. The first thing I did was, I don't know why, I just said, "Ladies and gentlemen," and my voice was normal. You know, I was all bandaged up and everything after having throat surgery, but 30 days later, I was back in the ring.
Yeah, you were back in the ring quickly. You know, there's moments, I guess, people go through, and a lot of people obviously deal with cancer because it really doesn't have, you know, prejudice or anything like that. Me personally, I've obviously dealt with it with my family, and my aunt survived cancer, breast cancer, and we had a moment where I was cutting her hair. She was going through radiation, chemotherapy, where she, you know, came to me and finally said, I think I want to get rid of it all and just accept the fact that I'm losing it. And she asked me, am I going to cry when I'm cutting her hair? And I said, no. So went through that process, cut the hair, and, you know, we both didn't cry. And I think that was a moment for her where she knew that she was strong and able to kind of fight
and
through.
she knew that you felt positive about the whole thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Was there a moment where, when you were going through treatments or going through the process, where you had those moments that you could look back on and say, that's one of those things that pushed me through?
Yeah, I was, Christine and I were engaged at that time and just about to get married and started making wedding plans. And that's probably the worst thing I felt, was having to lay this on her. And she was extremely strong, and actually she's the one that found the right surgeon that was like this great guy, Dr. Dale Rice at USC. And, you know, he just took a look at the MRI and the x-rays, and he said, we're going to have surgery and that'll be it. You know, no chemo. No. And I was like, okay. And that worked out pretty well.
Call her kind of your rock, I guess. She was your backbone in that situation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How do you look back on it now, being that it's 10 years beyond that point where, you know, you weren't really sure what was going to happen, if you were going to continue on? Like you said, you got back to work 30 days later. I'm
probably a happier person in a much better place at this point in my life. I really enjoy life a lot more, you know, when you face something like that, not knowing what the future's going to be. And big believer in karma. So you know, I don't steal the towels from the hotels anymore, and it just makes you a better person, I think, when you come up against that. And you know, naturally, you know, we're big supporters of all the different cancer charities. I mean, I always encourage people to get involved with charities that support not just research, but family support, because that's very important.
And last but not least, I guess when it's all said and done, when you look back on everything, what do you want people to remember about Michael Buffer?
You know, I hope people can remember that I love what I do, and that what I bring to the fight game, if anything, is you know, passion and compassion. I really, you know, I love being around the sport. There are things about it that I hate. You know, I hate it when I see guys that were great champions and 20 years later they're broke. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't know how to do it, but I want something to be done about that. You know, and it's a great sport, one that it's just, you know, two guys. When it's all said and done, it's not a team, it's not a coach, it's not, you know, you don't have Brady and Belichick, and you've got the two guys. And no matter what they're yelling from the corner, it doesn't make any difference. They can't hear it. They're in that ring, and it's one guy against the other. And today, one lady against the other, because we got, finally, the level of women's boxing is really starting to, you know, with the Olympics and everything, right. We're starting to get great fighters like, you know, Katie Taylor and Clarissa, and just a lot of good ladies as well. Out there. Yeah.
Appreciate it, Michael.
Thank you. Good to see you.
So for the record-setting, sold-out 90,000 fans here at Wembley Stadium and the millions watching around the world, ladies and gentlemen,